I'm Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, and we've decided to do a podcast called We Don't Have to Choose. Why that title? Well, several years ago, I heard Rachel Barco give a presentation at the University of Minnesota, and she said that if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. And that got me to thinking, why? Why does the criminal legal system not work to keep us safe? And what will keep us safe? That's what we're going to talk about on the podcast, that we don't have to choose between public safety and reform or changes or advancement, that those things we are trying to do here at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office will bring us public safety. We're thrilled to have Sasha Cotton as our guest on the podcast. Sasha, you and I have known each other about how many years? I was thinking about that.
It's been a while, at least 5.
Yeah, at least 5.
I would say between 5 and 10.
Yeah. So we, as you know, the podcast is about we don't have to choose between public safety and reform because the reforms are really about public safety. And so you are an expert in violence, which sounds like an odd way to...
Violence prevention.
Public health approaches to violence and violence prevention. But you live here in St. Paul. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yep. So I am a proud product of St. Paul Public Schools. Graduated from Central. I always have to say that. I feel like it's important to shout out my high school. I grew up in the Twin Cities. My parents are both from here, a Rondo kid. And so, have always just been compelled to be a person of service. And I feel like St. Paul breeds a lot of that, the Twin Cities.
So can you tell us a little bit about your path to the position that you're in now?
Yeah, I always tell people don't be afraid to quit because it really is a robust amount of direct service work that I got to do in my 20s that led me to having probably the experience and knowledge to start the Office of Violence Prevention in Minneapolis. So to start, did my undergrad in criminal justice and ethnic studies at Metro State, and started at Hamlin Law, decided that being an attorney was not for me, worked in corrections and probation and parole for the state, did some work around human trafficking with YouthLink, spent some time both with Ramsey and Hennepin County in probation, and then did a stint of time with the State Domestic Violence Coalition, really learning and unpacking the way that domestic violence shows up in Black and Brown communities in particular, and with young people. And then did a little stint at the University of Minnesota, and spent about a decade at the city of Minneapolis building out their violence prevention portfolio, a robust number of programs to really try to address and prevent violence in the community. That's where we got the chance to meet.
Yes.
And now I'm at the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College, where I'm leading a research center focused on violence prevention globally.
So I think people are more familiar with terms such as violence interrupters, that kind of thing, because of a lot of publicity in the last couple of years. But you were the head of the Office of Violence Prevention from its beginning. Can you talk about what you were brought in to do and what your thoughts were about how to address violence in Minneapolis?
Yeah, so when I started with the city, and I was sharing as we were coming up with some of the folks from your team, I started with the city at the beginning of 2013. And at that time, Minneapolis had started to really be recognized as a leader on the issue of youth violence prevention under the Blueprint for Action to Prevent Youth Violence, which was a program of Mayor Ryback, something that he was really passionate about. And it was largely about convening stakeholders, particularly jurisdictional partners, so the county, the city, the school board, libraries, to really think critically about how we prevented juvenile homicides and how do we get that number down to 0. So I was brought in to oversee that strategy. And at that time, the national work through the Obama administration was focused on something called the Youth National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention. And Minneapolis was one of 12 cities that was participating in that. So I was also leading our work there. So I had a chance to meet with stakeholders from across the country very early on to be thinking about violence prevention and to help ground Minneapolis in what sort of the national look should be. And what we learned very quickly is that we've got to be thinking about risk and protective factors when we talk about violence. So what are the things that make people particularly high risk? Not in a way that we're judging people or, punishing them for their risk, but really thinking about how do we focus on the people that need the best and most robust services. And then also, how do we protect people from violence through protective factors. So thinking about early on things like mentorship and stable families, stable neighborhoods, housing, education, these things that we think of as root causes that can lead someone to be precariously involved with violence or at high risk for being a victim or perpetrator of violence. And so when we talk about violence prevention, we're thinking about those things at a very basic level, that communities that are absent violence aren't that because they have a lot of police or because they have a lot of public safety. They're that because they have a lot of resources, they have a lot of wealth and asset that allow people to think about things and even conflict without it always leading to violence.
So you packed a lot in there. Let's go back and talk about what do we know about violence in communities, particularly among young people?
Yeah, so I always want to lead with violence is a learned behavior. And so it starts with us teaching and really unteaching the normalization of violence in most of America, that violence is a natural occurrence or a natural consequence of conflict, right? I think a lot of times people see those things as, mutually exclusive, but if you have conflict, it will ultimately lead to violence. And that just isn't true. We know that there are lots of ways that people resolve conflict, whether that's through conversation, a mutual agreement, an agreement to disagree, an agreement to never speak to each other again, to stay away from each other. But there are ways to navigate conflict without violence. And so that's an important thing to be thinking about. I think we in public health certainly think about violence and violence prevention in 3 layers. So we think about primary prevention, which are a lot of the things that I just talked about with you, housing and schools and stable families. We think about a second layer as what we would consider traditional prevention or intervention, right? That is identifying those who are at high risk. And in most places, quite honestly, it's about 0.5% of the population that's at extreme high risk for being involved with the next gun violence incident. And addressing those needs of people in that swath. And then at the very top, the smallest number of people who have the deepest needs are the people who've already been involved with violence and who are caught in a cycle of retaliatory violence because they do often find themselves in situations and in an ideology that violence is a natural occurrence to conflict.
So let's talk, let's put it in context a little bit in terms of what you did at OVP, the Office of Violence Prevention, when you came into Minneapolis. What was your focus on?
So first, we didn't have an OVP when I started in the city. As I said, I came in to lead this initiative under Ryback. And out of that, we quickly began to build work. And so the first things were really about community. We did things like pop-up parks, which was using vacant lots that had been, impacted by the tornadoes to give young people things to do. We started the Blueprint Approved Institute, which was really about building capacity for community members to address violence.
What did that look like?
That looks like training and paying for the training of, 6 to 10 organizations or individuals to both learn the very practical things that you need to know to work with the city. So how to fill out forms, how to get registered as a vendor, but more importantly, really understanding the crux of what violence prevention is. So thinking about this public health approach and thinking about how we create programs that reduce violence through that approach. So those 3 layers that I talked about, and really honing this idea that public safety needs to be expanded, that it's not just police, it's not just prosecutors, but that really everyone has a role to play and trying to find solutions to the problems that include everybody at all of those layers.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about police and prosecutors, I just heard yesterday, people come up to me and they say, don't we need longer sentences? Won't that prevent violence? Don't we need more cops? Won't that prevent violence? Why do those approaches not work?
Well, largely because they're punitive. And one thing that we know about human nature is that people learn to live in the conditions with which they're in. So incarceration, and as a public health, someone who's worked in public health for a long time, I always give the disclaimer, I'm a public health practitioner, but I work at a criminal justice system now, is that punishment alone doesn't work. Just like when we think about the COVID pandemic, putting people in quarantine without proper treatment is ineffective, right? So sometimes that proper treatment is just rest or a timeout. But when someone is really ill with the virus of violence, things like mental health support, conflict resolution, so all the things that build a person's capacity up to navigate the world are really important. And we know that it's very hit or miss on whether or not people are getting those things when they're incarcerated. But also, we know that punishment can't be the sole answer, that most people, even if they are incarcerated, are coming home. And unfortunately, often coming home worse in the sense of their likelihood to commit violence. And so prevention is so essential, because if we can help people to rethink about the way that they're operating in the world, provide them with the resources and the necessary tools, really, to navigate the world without violence, we can not eliminate policing and not eliminate violence, but we can manage it. Violence is a manageable problem, and we have a responsibility to manage it. And waiting until it happens and just punishing people is not a solution that I think any of us, when we really understand the nuts and bolts of it, could fully get behind, because punishment is at the end. And what we should really be trying to do is figure out how we address these problems at the very beginning.
I had a woman approach me at Pride, actually, and engage me in conversation and said, I think we need to have longer sentences to deter violence. And so we had a discussion about what actually did deter. But can you talk a little bit about why punishment in and of itself does not deter violent behavior?
Well, I mean, one is we know people live in the moment, right? And so when someone is faced with an initial conflict in the real world, right, they are not likely thinking about, if I do this, I'm going to go to prison, or if I get caught, right? They are navigating, again, the world with the tools that they have. And so the idea that long, particularly with young people, that long-term ability to plan and be intentional in the moment is in place is not true or reasonable when we think about the criminal legal system. But also that for some people who engage with violence on a routine basis because it's the only tool that they understand how to use, consequences like incarceration or proximity to the legal system are not that scary, quite honestly. It's sort of a normalized part of their experience. And so being incarcerated is not the threat that we sometimes think it is. And ultimately, again, I often take the position of, if that's the case, then we're really just saying we're going to lock people up forever and never let them come out. Because if we don't do something to change the minds of people and really want to address those root causes that we talked about before, but also really work with people who have already been caught up in a cycle of violence to change their circumstances, change their behavior. Most people who commit crime are not criminally deviant, right? They're not mentally ill. They're living in a set of circumstances that make violence seem reasonable. And until we address the reasonability of using violence in their circumstances, deterrence is not going to be found by police or prosecutors.
So why do people think it's reasonable?
I mean, I think a lot of it is what we've been taught, right? We've grown up in a society that is very focused on punitive outcomes. We historically have spanked children. We send them to detention. When we think about the very early ways that we talk about holding people accountable, it often leads with punishment and not teaching people new ways, trying to address, what is right and what is wrong morally, and really trying to set a tenor that talks about, why are you doing this and how do we get you to change your behavior? But that is more just like whack. We're just whacking people over the head and expecting them to get it. And sometimes that works, right? But it usually works with people who already have those morals, values, and norms in place and need a redirection, versus people who maybe haven't gotten those things and haven't been brought up in a way to believe that violence is even inherently wrong. And so changing those norms, both at the micro and the macro level, are so inherently important, because just punishing people, we've seen over and over again, doesn't work.
Yeah, I want to talk about how we change those norms, but you're reminding me, when I was a public defender and I represented, unfortunately, way too many young Black men, and we're talking like 18, 24, that kind of thing, they often would tell me their relatives were in prison, they expected to be in prison. It was kind of this is how my life is supposed to turn out. This is normal for my life. Can you talk a little bit about how a person gets to that place, a young person gets to that place where they think that the natural course of their life is to be incarcerated?
Yeah, unfortunately, we've got some issues with trajectory. And one, I want to call out that the Black community and Brown communities have been over-criminalized in this country for many, many years. We think about chattel slavery, when we think about the Trail of Tears, when we think about immigration. I don't want to get too deep into policy, but like all of these things have been focused on punitive outcomes and punishment, and severe punishment for failure to comply. And so I think when you have populations who have been dealing with a government that has dealt with them in their community in that way for a century now, it's natural to want to step outside of some of those guidelines and to feel like the system's not built for me anyways, right? There's things that are going to happen. I just have to navigate them the best way that I can. So I think there is a normalization because it is so common, because there are not very many Black and Brown families who don't have loved ones who have been interfaced with the criminal legal system. So of course that feels normalized. Then when you layer on the issues of poverty, and we know, unfortunately, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted by poverty, people are going to survive the best way that they know how. And if taking things, so, navigating systems with manipulation, through theft, through, all of the things, right? We don't have to get into them, is the only way to get by. It doesn't make it right, but it does make it normalized, right? That people feel like this is what they're going to do. So if for generation after generation, you've seen people in your family go to prison, you've seen people in your family be criminally convicted, you've seen them go to court, of course, over time, that starts to feel normal. Some of it is about access, though, right? That the more we can expose young people to what is out there and available to them, the more likely they are to, first of all, not get involved with the problems to begin with, but secondarily, to stop the behavior, right? When they feel like that is their most likely trajectory, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but I always say when I worked in community corrections, I had 2 clients that I ever, out of the hundreds of people that I served, and mostly young men and boys of color, that I ever felt truly fearful of. And one of them that always sticks out is a young man who was adjudicated delinquent in the juvenile system. He was an EJJ kid, extended juvenile jurisdiction, and he really wanted to be in an adult facility because that's where his uncles were, that's where his dad was. And so you could see that he was doing everything he could do to just get revoked so that he could go and do his time in an adult facility. And that really is an indictment on us as a system, that a 17-year-old, young man is like, just send me to real prison so I can do my time the way that I know how to do it, right? The fact that in his mind, he already knew how to do time was really telling. And so I think, that normalization that you're speaking of starts so early on. I also always have to talk about domestic violence as a factor here. A recent study that we did at John Jay shows that about 25% of cases that are domestic have one or both partners that have connections to community violence incidents as well. And so this overutilization of violence to solve one's problems, particularly when you're living in constant crisis, just feels normal for a lot of people.
So you've touched on a lot of issues of systemic racism. And so understanding that here we are as a result of structural racism, how is behavior redirect?
So what we have seen and what the data shows is relentless engagement is so important. As far as like the courts and the criminal legal system, transparency is really important, right? People do need to understand. And I always want to be super clear. None of this is about a free get out of jail card, right? Community violence intervention, violence prevention is not about saying when people commit crimes or they cause harm, they shouldn't be held accountable. It's both about saying that we should be doing everything that we can to prevent a person from getting to a point where they do something so horrendous that prosecution is even on the table. And also that we need to be thinking about transition back to community if they have to be removed as soon as possible. Excuse me. So I want to make sure I'm answering your question. Can you restate it again for me?
Sure. We're talking about how structural racism gets us to this point. How do we redirect behavior?
Yeah, well, it starts with being intentional, right? So naming it is so important. I think we've really struggled systematically with naming it. And then when we do name it, sometimes it feels hollow, right? So it feels very like a pat on the back to say, we've named it. Racism is a public health problem, and we know it is, right? But where are we looking at across all of our systems how we create repair? And so there's a public health sort of example that talks about, you know, a river and that there are babies falling into this river and we're catching them way downstream, right? The babies are floating, they're often dying way at the bottom of the stream. And everyone is rapidly trying to pull these kids out of the stream because we can see them and it's atrocious and we feel terrible, right? And oftentimes that's, quite frankly, the detentions and the prisons and the you know, systems, right, that are down there at the end of the river. But I think where the real equity comes into play is when someone pauses to say, we need to go to the beginning of the river and figure out why is someone throwing them in the river? Are they tripping over something? What's happening? And then also along the way, figuring out how we can pull people out sooner. So yes, stop the pipeline, right? And systemic racism has been a long lasting pipeline. Never gonna say that we can conquer it in a day, right? But we know that young people, particularly people of color, are overrepresented in all of these really terrible systems. We're not going to solve the problem overnight, but some of the violence prevention strategies that we've been looking at look to heal and add hope to young people who have been very hopeless. And I think that that's a really important part of any redemption story. So role modeling has been probably the biggest piece of all of this, is being able to identify people who have lived experience, who have been where these young people are at right now, and who can help pull them out of the river sooner.
Is that what people refer to as credible messengers?
It is. It's credible messengers. It's life coaches. It's VIs. You know, there's lots of violence interrupters. There's lots of titles for them, but they are such a unique and important part of any violence prevention strategy. The people who have influence. And there was a time when we thought about them as just, you know, sort of former gang leaders who would come home from prison. I think that has evolved dramatically and is now coaches and teachers and parents and just, you know, the guy who lives on the block who all the kids look at and are like, you know, he could have gone in a different direction, or maybe he did 10, 15 years ago, but now he's a construction worker and he owns a home and he drives a nice car. And like, how do I get from where I'm at now to that place? I think what is often missed is that real tangible role models for the young people that we're often talking about are not as visible as we sometimes take for granted for those of us who have had that as stability. I was talking with a friend the other day who does this work, and he was saying that he took a young man out to lunch for Father's Day, and the kid just broke down crying. And he said, why doesn't my dad want to do this with me? You know, you shouldn't be here with me. You should be with your own kids. You know, the guy who does this work, he said, listen, you know, my kids, one, they're adults. They love me. I'm going to see them at 4:00. But that kind of pain, right? And we can't replace their dads. But I know that that time spent, that investment, that is what deterrence looks like. That having somebody who believes in you, who believes that you can and expects you to be better, that is what leads to people's change, not bars. And that's not to say, again, that accountability through incarceration is off the table, but it should be our last resort, not our first.
Yeah, when you were giving that example of the babies, I was thinking that is exactly the system. Not that I didn't know this before this job, but seeing young people commit violence and then looking at their histories. I felt the same way as a public defender, actually, that when I got to know clients and hear their histories and hear things like you're sharing, I always thought we could have prevented this. We didn't have to be here. And I think that even more so now. And the separate tragic part of what I see about it is I meet with families, people who've been harmed and their loved ones have been harmed. And it feels very hollow to me to be saying, or for me to be saying, I am so sorry about what happened to you or your loved one, because we can't bring them back. But I also know and feel very confident about the fact that we could have prevented this had we just invested in different ways. I want to, and there are a number of different programs. Can we go back to when you were in Minneapolis, and can you talk about some of the programs that you created and kind of facilitated along the way that were extremely successful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have the pleasure of leading at the global level the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay College, which is the home of the group violence intervention. And it was one of the first strategies that we launched in Minneapolis. I believe we got the funding from the federal government through the National Forum that I talked about earlier, Obama, in 2016, and launched that program in 2017. And what we saw were dramatic reductions, particularly in group member involved incidents of shootings and particularly non-fatal shootings, but some reductions on homicides as well. Over the 3-year period that we were really able to do evaluation, 2017, 18, 19, obviously in 2020, things changed dramatically across the globe, and certainly here in Minneapolis, we saw 66% reductions in group member involved shootings, which is remarkable and also proof that it is real and can happen. Minneapolis is not the only city to have seen those kinds of reductions. This model is based on the Boston Miracle, which saw 60% reductions in juvenile homicides as a result of this strategy, which is really about bringing community and community violence interventionists and law enforcement and the criminal legal system to the table together to gather the best of what we have to offer.
Can I jump in and ask you a question? It's called GVI, Group Violence Intervention, and sometimes people say, well, what you mean is gangs. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of reasons why we're explicit about calling it a group violence intervention versus a gang. One, there's a federal definition and guidelines around what it means to be a gang member that we don't use or adhere to at the national network because it doesn't really fit the moment that we're in necessarily, but also because it misses the point. So what we're actually trying to look at when we talk about groups is the potential for retaliation, right? So we don't care if you wear the same headbands or you wear the same colors or even, claim the same neighborhoods, right? What we're really looking at is the dynamic of if Sasha and Mary are close and they both have been historically prone to using violence to solve their problems and Mary gets hurt, who is the most likely person to retaliate on Mary's behalf? It's probably Sasha and the other 2 or 3 people that hang out with him, right? And if that's what we're looking at, then these federal definitions don't always apply. Trying to look at the traditional markers of, did we see tattoos or did we see similar color? It just doesn't apply. It's not the world that we're living in. It's also not driven by money in the way that we have historically thought about gangs. It can be, but I think we don't hold ourselves accountable to the human nature aspect of what retaliation really is about. I think it is a human feeling when someone hurts someone that you care about to feel vengeance. I think social emotional regulation helps those of us who have it to say, and I can't do that. I should not do that. The right way to handle this is to file a police report. The right way to handle this is to, advocate for systems change, right? All of the things. But for people who, one, those systems have not traditionally worked for them, and two, are living outside of some of those social norms about violence, retaliation is a very normal way to resolve a conflict. And retaliation leads to most of the shootings that you see in most major cities. So what we seek to do is get to that person who we think is most likely to retaliate, talk to them about the risk that they put themselves in by retaliating, and be honest with them about the legal consequences. That, hey, we believe you'd be the next person to do this shooting because how close you guys are. We don't want you to do that, but there are these legal consequences if you do. And also, what can we do to help you, right? We understand that there's grief involved if you lost a loved one. We understand that maybe opportunities haven't been made available to you, like education and housing. We understand you might feel afraid for your own life, that someone's trying to hurt you. So how do we address those things that could take you outside of even your best judgment in making good decisions? And so that's really what it's about.
Part of that intervention has to do with hospitals. Can you talk about that?
So the hospital-based interventions are actually separate. They can, they touch. So in Minneapolis, we historically have talked about the 3 strategies that we really lifted up as our big 3, GVI being one of them. Next Step, which is our hospital-based violence interruption program here in Minneapolis, is really about just that, responding and intervening to violence at the hospital. When we think about that data-driven perspective, and that's also the thing that I think is so important to talk about, when we look at media and we talk to people who've experienced violence, it can sound so pervasive, right? It can sound like, oh my gosh, everyone's experienced this and everybody's high risk. Again, about 0.5% of the population in most major cities. So we're talking about in really big cities, a couple hundred people, in small places, a couple dozen, right? We're not talking, we can wrap our arms around half of those people. Those are half of the incidents, right? That we might be able to prevent. So this work works for that reason when we're data driven, right? But when we think about people, we can think about places, right? And there's 3 places that people at high risk are most likely to fall. That's in criminal legal systems because they interface with police and prosecutors. So GBI does a good job of wrapping those people up. They're in hospitals because unfortunately they are disproportionately impacted by gun violence and they get shot. And so when they get shot is an opportunity to really have that bedside intervention and have that conversation both about retaliation because maybe they haven't been seriously injured. And so because they've been grazed or received a wound, but are being discharged and might be thinking about going out and shooting back at the people who shot at them tomorrow, we want to intervene as quickly as possible and offer them that same conversation about resources and supports, whether this is a retaliatory incident or maybe they were just an innocent bystander. And so next step, it doesn't have that group element. It is really just about anyone who comes in and is a victim of a shooting.
I'm going to circle back to your role here in Minneapolis. And I know evidence-based practices were critical to the work that you were doing. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in Minneapolis, we were replicating, and I believe they still are, 3 evidence-based practices. And the reason evidence-based practice was always so important to me as a leader is because if we're going to invest, taxpayer dollars into strategies, then they should be ones that have been rooted in evidence and data, that have been empirically researched and proven to have impact. And so we over-invested in those kinds of strategies when I was with Minneapolis. The 3 strategies that we were replicating in Minneapolis were the group violence intervention, which I've talked a little bit about before, is the one that I get to lead globally and I'm so proud of. The hospital-based violence interruption model, which is Next Step, and that started at HCMC and now is at North Memorial and Abbott, and then violence interrupters or cure violence replication. And so I think as of late, Minneapolis has been hearing a lot about violence interrupters or VIs. And largely that's because, one, it's the newest of those 3 strategies. So it's newer than the other 2, but also because it is the most visible violence intervention model I think that Minneapolis has leveraged. And so when we think about strategy, we think about need, there are 3 places that we can really think about the highest risk individuals being at. And with GBI, it is really focused on people who have already had some kind of a touch point with systems. So they've already interfaced with law enforcement, probation and parole, those kinds of systems. And unfortunately, folks who are involved with violence are disproportionately represented in those places as just makes sense, right? Unfortunately, they get shot and they show up in hospitals. And so Next Step is really designed to meet the needs of those people who come to hospitals because of their proximity to violence. Violence prevention is all about proximity and trying to assess who is closest to the violence and how do we pull them away from that proximity.
So how do you assess that?
So data is such an important part of this. And with the group violence intervention, what's called a problem analysis is done at every site that we go to, and it's updated usually every 6 months to a year. And what it's really looking at is shootings and homicides over the last year. When we first started, last 2 years of shootings, last year and a half of homicides, right? We're trying to get trends. We're trying to understand is there natural retaliation happening? We're trying to understand who are the key players, right? And then we're also not just looking at the victim and the perpetrator of an incident, but we're really looking at the others and the witnesses, because what you can really drill down to is, it seems like this person has been at the last 3 shootings in this neighborhood, or they were a victim once, but they're always around. They're always in proximity to these things that are happening. So how do we pull them back from that, right? So the data tells a story. We also do an activity with law enforcement and a rigorous activity with community partners to drill down on people and places, right? So this is not a guessing game, right? It really is about using metrics and data to identify people who are at high risk and then focus our energies on maintaining that information through review, working with law enforcement, working with community partners separately, right? I always want to name that because this is not about law enforcement getting information from their community partners. This is about the community doing its work and getting the information it needs. and law enforcement doing its work, which it naturally does, right? So I always want to add that caveat. The GBI is not about layering on additional law enforcement. It is about transparency, about the role of law enforcement in prosecution, and also pulling back the curtain. That so often people think that they're operating in incognito, like that no one knows that it's them. And sometimes that alone, going to someone's door and saying like, hey, we're not here to arrest you. We don't have probable cause or any case that we're building, but your name is coming up in rooms that it shouldn't be, right? You are in places that put you at great danger of being a perpetrator or a victim of gun violence.
Can I jump in there? Because I think this has to do a lot, as I understand it, with the credibility of the program.
Yes.
That you can't just maybe sit around and say, hey, we're gonna focus on so-and-so in this particular group, because that particular group might not be, nothing's happening there.
That's right.
And so how do you, you talked a little bit about it. It's trying to figure out who's at shootings, who are really the people that you're concerned about. How does that information come about?
So there's a couple of mechanisms. One is this initial problem analysis that I talked about, which is a retroactive look. And again, this is about centering the way we want law enforcement to participate in public safety, right? And so people, I think, often think about law enforcement as sort of officers who are out there chasing people down. But one of the things that law enforcement does really well is capture data and capture information. And so as a part of this strategy, on a weekly basis, there is a meeting called a shooting review. And that is an opportunity to review every shooting that has happened in the city over the last 7 days, not for the purpose of solvency. So, and that it's difficult to get law enforcement to meet in a room and not be focused on how do we solve this case, because that's generally their job, is to solve that case. What we're trying to say is, we don't want to solve, yes, we want you to solve it, but do that at a different meeting. We want to talk about the potential for retaliation. So, this is the victim, this is the perpetrator. You guys have a responsibility to go out and try to arrest the person who you believe did that. That's separate from GBI, right? Correlation, but separate. What we're trying to figure out is, if this person got shot, maybe his dad has had a propensity to violence in the past. Maybe he hasn't been active for a long time, but would his son getting shot maybe reactivate him? Brother is in prison, but we're hearing these calls on the jail calls that he's encouraging people to go out and retaliate because his brother got shot, right? Again, none of this is necessarily criminal where we can go out and charge anybody, but we should be having intentional conversations with people to say, you should know, we know this, right? Not in a way that compromises the investigation of law enforcement, but that does let people know they're not operating in isolation. People are aware of their contributing factors to the situation. And if things go awry, we'll be back at your doorstep with a different conversation, right? And before that happens, we want to do everything that we can to identify resources, supports, and helps so that you don't make that decision. Right?
So how do those conversations happen?
So there's two ways. One is a call-in, and that's usually what people associate with the group violence intervention. It is an elaborate meeting where the mayor and the chief and the district attorney or the prosecutor in that area, the USA, come together along with community speakers. So we usually have a voice of pain, a voice of redemption, and a voice of hope. And the legal system talks about the legal consequences for involvement with gun violence. It's pretty straightforward. I always say generally the prosecutors, both at the local and the federal level, have the most, attention of the young men who are invited. So the folks who are invited to this meeting are usually people who are involved with gun violence, who are involved with group violence. They're generally on probation. And sometimes they are the most high-risk people, but sometimes they've really been called in to be messengers back to their friends. And so we're really clear to say, if this message doesn't apply to you, right? If you don't feel like you're the intended target, this is not a secret meeting. This meeting is happening because we are worried about you. We're worried about your behavior, but we're also worried about your safety. And then the community speakers talk about the impacts of gun violence on their lives, and then there are resources and services for them. That can happen quarterly. It's a lot of work. It's important. But increasingly what we are learning is that what we call custom notifications have greater impact. As a matter of fact, some recent research out of Philadelphia shows that up to 30% reductions in retaliatory violence can be achieved just through custom notifications. So if no one takes services, no one wants help, just by having someone come to their home, so this is usually how a custom happens. It could be at a library, it could be at a probation office, but often it's at someone's home. Respectfully, right? We try to set these up in advance. We try to let people know that we're coming so that it's not a surprise. It is a marrying of a law enforcement person, a community person, and a community violence interventionist or a credible messenger. Coming, it usually takes less than 10 minutes, talking with that individual who has been identified as high risk. But if they're not there, with their family, right? It might be mom, it might be a sister, it might be a partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, to say, one, to the degree that we can tell you legally, these are the legal consequences. If you were to get stopped with another firearm, if you were to get arrested with another gun, in some places, prosecutors or police chiefs actually pen a letter that says, hey, you married, right? You've had these 3 felonies in the past. We're worried because your friend got shot that you're going to retaliate. If you do, you could be facing this much time, right? So it can get that drilled down, but it can also just be, hey, your name has come up in these rooms. We're really worried about your behavior. You have felonies, or if you don't have felonies, this is what can happen. This is how this could impact your life legally. And then someone from the community, a pastor, a coach, a parent, saying like, this sucks, right? I'm really sorry that someone you care about got hurt, and that shouldn't happen, right? That shouldn't happen. It's terrible. And also, you going out and shooting somebody else is not going to solve that problem. It's going to put you at risk. It's going to put your whole family at risk. It's not good. And then a social service provider or community violence interventionist saying, these are the kinds of supports that we can offer you, right? Do you need to be relocated? Are you worried about your own safety? Do you need employment? Do you need mental health services? Do you need education, right? So offering that wide swath of information. In a jurisdiction where we just were out with a team doing these, was a young man, immigrant family. Parents are present, but you can tell they're not really running the house. You can tell the sister's really running the house. And as we're going through, he's been arrested 40 times in the last year and a half. And the sister goes, you need to find something else to do because you're not even good at this, right? Like, you've been arrested 40 times and she's like, I knew he wasn't home sometimes at night, but I thought he was like at a girl's house or crashing on a friend's couch. Well, half of those times he had been arrested, sometimes for low-level things, sometimes for being, theoretically in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he was far more connected to violence than she had realized. Mm-hmm. And now, as an older sister and someone who had, some oversight with him, she could lean in and ultimately was like, you know what? You're going to stay with our grandparents. This that you're doing, this isn't working, right? And so without any systems, real intervention, without any programming, that was cut off, right? The likelihood for him to retaliate, the likelihood for him to get hurt, all of those things were dealt with within the context of their family structure. Mm-hmm. And that's the important part, right? Is that whether it's through services, because we always say it's not take the services or get the consequence, right? Mm-hmm. It's that the consequences are there if you do the thing, right? If you commit the shooting, if you commit the violence, the consequences are there and they eventually catch up to most people. But before you make those choices, let's have a conversation about what's possible, whether it's within the context of your family or outside supports.
So we talked about the hospital intervention. Let's skip to or go to the third part of it.
Yes. So violence interrupters are really that third leg of the evidence-based replications in Minneapolis, and really of the evidence-based replications across the globe. GVI, hospital-based, and care violence or street outreach are kind of the hallmarks of what you're looking for. And violence interrupters are street outreach workers. They are people who have relationships in the community, who are on the ground, some who are formerly involved with groups and gangs, some who are formerly incarcerated, but some who are teachers, some who are parents, some who are coaches, but who have the credibility without police to go into community and say, essentially, knock it off, right? Your behavior is egregious. It hurts our community. We care about you, but we don't like what you're doing. And we want to offer you, similar to a custom notification, we want to offer you supports and resources. Or if it's a hot button issue and something has just happened in the community, we want to mediate a conflict, right? We want to, in the moment, say, this group, this person, we know there's tension. We know that something has happened that could lead to real violence. And before it does, let's broker some kind of an arrangement. So similar to the custom where it's happening in the home, these kinds of things are happening on the streets, right? They're being negotiated on the streets, and they're being negotiated absent of traditional systems. So GBI includes traditional systems as a partner, and violence interruption is absent those traditional systems partners, and is really relying heavily on the community and its influence.
That still sounds as though it involves a lot of training.
Absolutely. It should.
Well, so I think it gets confusing because in Minneapolis, too, you see people wearing particular colored T-shirts or belonging to particular organizations. Are those the same thing, or is there something that differentiates the people that have that particular training that has fidelity to the model?
Yes. So with any of these strategies, when we're talking about the replication of evidence-based practice, it needs to be a replication, right? So we think about these things like recipes, right? That they have ingredients, there's a methodology, there's a practice, there's training. And when you do them absent any of those things, you can really cause harm. And that is so important to know. Public safety is about keeping the public safe. And so when we put people out into the world, whether that's law enforcement, violence interrupters, the support and outreach folks from GBI, without proper training, without proper tools, without proper supports, we put them at risk and we put the community at risk. So training is essential. We at the National Network provide intensive training to the folks who do work with us on a weekly basis. We are meeting with staff. We are providing comprehensive training. We, as a matter of fact, will be in Minneapolis to do some training with folks in July. And I know that our counterparts at Cure Violence also offer comprehensive training. I know it starts with a 40-hour in-depth training model for violence interrupters and outreach workers. Supervisors receive additional 40 hours of initial training. And then there's ongoing training that should be happening and compliance to the model and the fidelity of what the training entails. And so when people step away from that, it can cause real harm.
So I want to circle back to all the work that you did in 2016, 17, 18, 19. You said that it was highly successful. Can you explain more about that?
Yeah, I mean, Minneapolis had done a lot of policy and a lot of convening, but hadn't really programmed this work. And so launching the group violence intervention and getting the kind of reductions that we saw in shootings was, I think, a huge marker for success. Next Step was also coming along at that same time. So we think the combination of having targeted programs focused on reducing gun violence really helped us to see reductions in gun violence. It also helped to cultivate the talent that exists in Minneapolis. And I always, want to call out the fact that we think about the people who are best designed or best set up to do this work. They are people who have credibility in those communities. They are people who can, will, and are regularly open to being trained and applying the model as it should be applied. And unfortunately, that can be hard. It can be hard to find those people who are both connected and willing to work in partnership with government to get this done. And I know that can sound strange, like, well, why wouldn't people want to do this? But going back to some of our earlier comments, government has not always been friendly or an asset to people in communities where violence is very prevalent. And generally, when the government shows up, it is in a punitive nature, whether that's a housing authority or schools or whatever, right? And so finding community allies who are willing to take up this banner and say, I'm in it to fight for our kids, I'm in it to fight for our communities, train me, teach me, I know some things, right? But I need guidance and direction on how to do this based on my research. That was, I think, a huge part of our success, was trying to identify those people, get them properly trained, and help them navigate city and government systems. Because I was just in a training and conference earlier this week, and actually Mayor Baraka out of Newark talking about procurement, right? That procurement and finance processes, the honest to God truth is that they're just not set up to accommodate the needs of this kind of work, right? And that doesn't mean we want them to be absent accountability, just like we're talking about, the way that criminal legal systems can be punitive. Procurement processes are quite punitive as well. And of course, people need to be accountable with government money. They need to be held accountable with what they do with it. But when we're out trying to save the lives of young people, there's got to be enough flexibility and creativity within the framework to meet the needs of the people and be accountable to how the dollars and cents have been spent. So, one thing that we talked a little bit about, but I feel like is important to highlight, is sort of the relationship between all of these kinds of programs and their funders and the people who support them. And I know across the country, I certainly, know that some of it is happening here in the Twin Cities, is how do we navigate the needs of the folks who are receiving the funding? We talked a little bit about training. And I know that I mentioned before, procurement is such a challenging part of this. And that's, I don't say that because I think that they're trying to be challenging. I think that government in and of itself is an insulary model, right? It's used to doing things the way that it's used to doing them. And we have all kinds of attorneys who are designed to mitigate risk, right? That's the goal, right?
That's our office.
That's the
our
goal.
Civil division.
Yes. And so,
And to jump in about procurement, it's how to get a contract.
yes.
So in the city, the county, any government
Yes.
agency is going to make you jump through hoops to get a contract, but also to submit invoices and on the business side. And we've often seen that small businesses and sometimes the groups we're talking about aren't necessarily used to or want to be involved in that piece of it, but they're really good at it.
That's right. And so, one sort of rule to consider when working with folks in community in general, but certainly we think about the skill set that we'd look to violence interrupters or people doing violence prevention work for, is how do we help them navigate these very complex government structures around finance and contract, because they aren't business owners. Many of them have started small nonprofits in order to contract with government, but it's not their strong suit. And generally speaking, the city and the county don't afford them the resources to pay a bookkeeper or someone to manage those things. So they're really trying to figure it out on their own, which leaves them at a great disadvantage. And so it is one of the biggest things that I think we at the national level have been trying to champion, is how do you put in place either the proper training and support to help them be successful. I think the narrative, and again, this is a national problem, is that people who are really good at the work are often not going to have that back office strength. And people with that back office strength are often not going to have the skills to reach the young people who are at highest risk of being involved with violence. And so how do we marry some of that together? And it seems like there's lots of people out there who can do spreadsheets and figure out how to do contracts, right? So how do we, as government, help the people who we've identified as being good and highly qualified and who have already been trained to do this work, to get the support that they need on the back end to be solid? I also think that there's a narrative, and it's very unfortunate because most of the folks who do this work come from Black and brown communities. There's this narrative because sometimes there are gaps or things that happen with the paperwork that are imperfect, that it's intentional. And I think generally speaking, and of course, there's always going to be outliers, and there have been some horrendous cases of fraud and egregious behavior in other cities that we've seen be prosecuted. But I think oftentimes they need more handholding. They need more support. And so government is going to have to reconcile with what that looks like in order to get the best work product, because this is not buying paper, right? And I think when we think about procurement and contract processes inside of government, they pay for a lot of things. They pay for snow removal and they pay for power and water, but this is paying for people power. And so when we're talking about people power for the most important thing in our community, safety and young people, we've really got to think about how we simplify the process to make it reasonable and user-friendly for the folks who we know we need to do this work.
It's also not like most contracts where you are going to send 10 people to a particular program that costs this much for 10 people. And that, as we were talking about, that is not necessarily the resources that we're talking about here.
No, I mean, when we think about things like relocation and the right supports for people who are very high risk, it's much more like witness protection, right? And so there's not a fine-tooth comb necessarily to go through how police do witness protection. We trust that they are following things the way that they're supposed to. And I know that there are some checks and balances, but we accept that they're doing that with the best intention of the person they're trying to keep safe so that they can move through the public safety system to the best of their ability. And I just don't think that community violence intervention has been given that same level of credibility or respect. And that's a part of the problem, is that people have to be properly trained, but that's not just the people doing the work. It's also inside of the systems. How do we change the current system to accommodate the needs? So is there someone who's dedicated to walking through those processes with them to make sure that they're in place? And I think that happens in varying degrees in varying different places, but it's not a set practice in the way that there are practice and procedure for other public safety entities inside of government. And I think that's something that certainly locally, but at the national level, we've got to grapple with.
So in terms of police, those kinds of structure, I mean, they've been contracted. They know how to do a budget. They know how to do all of that.
But they have staff for it too.
And they have staff for it. And what we're talking about here is relatively new.
Absolutely. It's relatively new. And I think that the work has grown faster than government has to accommodate it. The unfortunate part is that it seems like the community and the community violence interventionists who are doing the work and the agencies that are doing the work are the ones who are being treated harshly, in my opinion. And again, this is not just a Minnesota problem, but across the board, there's an expectation that they have this robust bookkeeping system, when in reality, most government doesn't have what it needs to both understand the way that this work works so that it can build out infrastructure and systems to support the people doing the work, or to hold them accountable, right? Because we do want to make sure that if people are getting funded to do this work, they're doing it, they're using the money the way that it's intended to be spent, but there's got to be a nimbleness inside of that, and there's got to be accountability measures inside of government that understand this is not buying paper or, paying for goods, right? It is really about supporting whole individuals and getting them out of really precarious situations, which sometimes requires thinking outside of the box.
And to say once again, this is about replicating a model, a data-based model with training, data. I'll let you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 3 strategies that we've talked about here are all rooted in evidence and science. They've been empirically researched and proven to work. And so following those models is really important. But they all start with the premise that we need to wrap our arms around these people and provide them with the supports and resources that they need to move away from the violence. So when governments gut the ability for social service agencies or violence interrupters to do that, they really render them helpless. And so a question that I've asked when we talk to our law enforcement partners, because sometimes they get a little itchy about, well, they've got this money and, whatever, is you go out and do your job every day with a gun and a badge and a bulletproof vest and other tools, right? Along with your training. The tools and resources that people who are doing violence interruption work have is, 1, the support of their funders, right? So they need robust champions that are supporting them, their training, and their relationships, right? Those are the things that they do their work with. So when we as funders or trainers, in my case, interrupt that, we render them really helpless, and it puts them in a precarious situation. And just like law enforcement, they're working in communities that are extremely exposed to violence and conflict. And so if we put them at risk, we're really talking about putting their safety at risk. And that shouldn't be something that any of us want.
So when we met and I got to sit in on a call-in or 2, I was really excited about the work. And so when I became county attorney, I was trying to figure out how can we incorporate this? And I don't know if it's us, our office, or what it is, but how can we do this? We were fortunate enough to hire Jen White, who worked for you, to come here at the county attorney's office. And we've been working with you on YGVI.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yes, I mean, it's super exciting, and Hennepin County has been a champion on this, and one of our pilot locations, along with Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in launching a specific model of GVI for juveniles. And that is so important because the model was really rooted in working with adults. That's how it started. it's really always been about, because of the connection to the criminal legal system, there was always hesitation about involving young people as participants. And when I was working for the city and I was project managing the work, what we would see is that young people would often be in the cars that were getting pulled over. They would often be at the homes where custody notification was happening, and they were getting the consequences, quite frankly, right? If there was a shooting that was group member involved, they were still getting arrested, but they weren't getting the offer of services that their adult counterparts were getting because we weren't doing that for juveniles. And so having this juvenile model where we can both offer those support and services to the most high risk, but also really intervene as early as possible with young people who are either peripherally or directly involved with gun violence has been such a gift. So, thank you for championing that work and really wanting to bring it to Hennepin County, because we've seen, significant impact. I know that we're getting ready to do another data analysis for you all shortly, but we know that this work is working. And I think the innovation to being able to look countywide and not just at the city of Minneapolis, but we know that young people in particular, they move around and they don't care about jurisdictional boundaries. And so expanding that to a broader scope has been really remarkable, and we're looking forward to continued work with you all.
As we are too. What are you excited about in the future?
So we are actually in the process of launching some work that's looking specifically at the intersections of community violence, so much of what we've talked about here, and intimate partner violence. And I'm really excited about that because we know that violence is a learned behavior. And we know that the earlier we can get to people who have experienced violence, the better off they will be in the long run. And so while we want to deal with those people in the home who are having the conflict, the children who are in the home watching it often bear the most burden of learning that violence is an acceptable way to navigate conflict. And so I'm really excited about that. We are also working on training law enforcement departments across the country on how to better work with community violence interventionists, and opposite, right? Training CVI organizations or community violence organizations on how to work with law enforcement. So as we think about expansion across public safety and making it not just be about police and prosecutors, but really creating this ecosystem that includes schools and community and parents, we've got to broaden the scope, but we've got to teach those people how to work together. And that hasn't always been done intentionally. We've sort of thrown people together and said, figure it out. And that's hard. And in part, it's hard because law enforcement has been the face of folks who are out in community. And often violence interrupters or support and outreach folks from GVI can get put on purpose or by accident in this role of police assistants. And that's not what they are. They have skills and relationships and training that uniquely position them to do their work. And when they're boxed in just being police assistants, they're not going to do the best work, and the community's not going to receive them in the ways that they should be set up to be received. And so really helping to navigate that with law enforcement and with community partners is something I'm very excited about.
I'm excited about it too. Thank you so much for being here and for all of your work. I mean, it's really groundbreaking, not only across the country, but across the world.
Thank you, Mary. It's always a pleasure to come home and be back in the Twin Cities and talk about the work that has been built here and also the work that I'm doing globally. So thank you for the invitation.
Of course.